do now is I'm going to be going over all the dollar pairs one more time just for the next 24 or 48 hours for you guys to see how they're going to break down in a very simplistic fashion. Here we go. So looking at euro to US dollar on the 4-hour time, on the daily time frame, as of right now, we can see that euro US dollar is showing no signs of relief or exhaustion as of right now, but we can see that we are in a very critical area, and we do want to see how this is going to be forming out, right? Is it going to start decelerating and forming some type of reversal pattern, or are we going to see further continuations to the downside, right, by impulsing below that monthly support, that 117.12, and from there showing continuation? Now, pulling it to the 4-hour time frame, guys, as of right now, we can see that euro to US dollar is starting to decelerate or is starting to slow down. And so there is going to be 2 possible scenarios. We can see an initial impulse that was made to the downside, followed by relief. We do see continuation. One thing to take into consideration is that it's not continuation, but that is warranted as a reversal pattern. And so with that being said, guys, it's going to be very interesting to see what structure does within that area. If we do start to falsely break those lows and break back in, you could expect for some type of small continuation pattern and run that back to the tops. Stops would be moved to break even, and that would be a short-term buy. Remember, the big buys are not warranted until you do see a strong enough impulse to the upside above that 119.40, followed by some type of pullback, and then from there, once that breaks, that is your big rally back to the upside. Now, the sell is only going to be warranted if you are not in the sell already. If this pulls back, creating short-term relief, once that breaks out, you're running it all the way back to the monthly support and potentially even past. Once you get to here, stops and move to break even, and you give it a shot. Looking at USD CAD on the daily time frame, like we said, guys, we're in a very choppy area as of right now, as that 129 to 130 handle has been regarded as a very, very strong area for the sellers, being able to grab a tremendous amount of pending orders. And one thing more importantly is you do want to factor in the weekly time frame and what's going on with structure. We do have that impulse, we do have that relief, we have another impulse, and we do have that another relief. So the question is, are we going to be getting this trade once again, right? And so we can see within the smaller structure, you do see an impulse followed by a relief. And so if this does break out, the question is this going to be the big sell to the downside, just like we saw back in May of 2017, right? Or is this start going to decelerating and pulling back to the trend? And so that is the big question. But as of right now, we are still sell bias on US dollar CAD. And so looking at it as of right now, we can see that we did have an initial impulse and we failed to warrant a continuation pattern, right away, rejecting these previous lows. But we can see here that structure is now in fact creating somewhat of a short-term bullish trend, this being the low, this being the previous high, and this being the higher low, right? And so with that being said, it's going to be quite interesting to see what USD CAD does with this initial impulse as well, followed by this area of profit taking. And so looking at it from a 4-hour time frame perspective, we can see, guys, that we do have a couple of things going on. First and foremost, we do have this ascending trend being formed as of right now. Secondly, we do have this impulse here. And thirdly, we do have this short-term ascending trend that was just broken, followed by lower lows that were formed. And so with that being said, most likely structure will continue back to this ascending trend. And the question is, do we break, in fact, those lows? From there, followed by create a continuation pattern and expect that big trade all the way back down to the weekly support. Is that going to happen? That is a big possibility. Now, if we do start to slow down in this area and start to create a reversal pattern like we did in the past, then we're going to look for short-term higher highs, followed by a short-term continuation pattern and looking to run that back to the upside, simply for the fact that you guys want one thing. And so being said, until we do in fact break the highs or the lows of that range, you're simply playing within it. Looking at US dollar Japanese yen from the daily time frame, just like we've been saying on the past weeks, this has been treated as correction, and we are still expecting continuation back to the downside, right? And so any bullish movements to the upside would be treated as short term. As of right now, we can see structure is attempting to test that previous high that it did break, potentially creating a higher low, right? And so there are a couple scenarios that can take place. One thing do take into consideration is that we are now seeing rejections of that previous 111 to 112 handle, and we can see in the past that was a very strong area of support, turn newfound resistance, and so we can see that there were a tremendous amount of pending orders sitting there, which the sellers were able to grab and take out the buyers. And so with that being said, a couple of ways US dollar Japanese yen is going to be playing out. As of right now, this is the current trend that we are in. Please be aware that the US dollar Japanese yen is not a complete sell until we do in fact crack that 108.646 handle. With that being said, this is creating short-term continuation pattern. Once that does break, that is your short-term sell back to the downside, right? If that fails to happen and you do start to see a false break back into that previous low that we did in fact break, then from there that becomes your descending trend line. And once we do in fact break back above that previous low, warranting another false break, followed by a short-term continuation pattern, you could run that all the way back to tops, being this a short-term bullish momentum play. Once you get to the top, stops and move to break even, and you see if you can give it a shot all the way to that descending trend line. Failure to do so may just warrant consolidation within this area, and that is not something that you guys should be interested in doing. So once that breaks, really in reality, it's which way is the structure going to break. As of right now, you do that, have that initial impulse, and so most likely the sell is more likely to happen than the buy, but we will trade what we see, not what we think. Pound dollar, once again, guys, we have been stating that this is creating somewhat of a reversal pattern after that initial impulse was made, followed by that type of pattern rather than a continuation pattern. But one thing to take into consideration is that structure is not showing any signs of deceleration as of right now, but potentially could be grabbing some bullish orders for potential big rally back to the upside, going back to this previous low, then from there warranting that as relief for another drop all the way back to the downside. You guys have to take into consideration the longer time frames, especially looking at it on pound dollar right now structure. So you guys do have to take into consideration the longer time frames, guys, and looking at pound dollar and saying, okay, well, what is going on with the nature of structure? And we can see it does start with an impulse followed by a relief or liquidation, and then from there you do see a continuation of that impulse, and from there we can see we're in the same area. One thing to take into consideration is that this trend did in fact just break, plus that previous low did in fact break, creating lower lows. So I'm not surprised if pound just continues to drop, because that is what structure is telling us that it should do, right? The trend is our friend. And so looking at it from a smaller time frame perspective, right, we can see that pound dollar is in a very critical area with this initial impulse occurring, this being warned as a reversal pattern or profit taking, or just a very decelerated, slow descending channel. One thing that we did state was that low, in fact, did need to be broken for us to see continuations down. We did, in fact, miss that previous sell, and so shout out to you guys for whoever was able to get it. And so you are, in fact, seeing another sell setup. Once pound does break out, you do have one more sell to the downside to the 132.20 handle, and from there, you guys really do want to see what does it start to do. Does it create a continuation pattern, or does it start to create a reversal pattern? Looking at, guys, AUD USD on the daily time frame, very interesting scenario. As of right now, we can see the false breaks occurring near that daily support as of right now, and so we can see that after that initial impulse was made, we can see that we were in a reversal formation, and so as of right now, we are creating short-term higher highs with the daily retest being a pin bar, bullish hammer, whatever you want to call it. And so with that being said, looking at it from the smaller time frame perspective, we can see that AUD USD does have some potential to go to the upside to that daily descending trend line. And so as of right now, there's really going to be two ways that AUD USD does play out. Since we did in fact falsely break these lows, right, we can see that we did have this initial impulse to the upside followed by short-term relief. If we do in fact break out and potentially create a small-term higher highs, you could expect one more rally to the upside, creating this a short-term bullish run. Please note that this is not going to be a long-term bullish run until you do in fact see that 77.85 crack. Once that is cracked, followed by a short-term continuation, that is your rally all the way back to the upside. Right now, if that fails to happen and this gets capped out, really in the end of the day, your ultimate goal is to wait for this head and shoulders pattern to break out, this being the neckline. Once you do see a sharp move followed by a short-term continuation pattern, you could run that all the way back to the lows, this being short-term once again, or higher risk exposed, because you need to take into factor that you are range bound, and you need to take into fact how extended this entire structure is. Last but not least, NZD USD, looking at it from the daily time frame, very similar to AUD USD, we can see that we do have a very sharp impulse to the downside, followed by short-term liquidation or profit taking. And so there is a chance that NZD USD can in fact tag these previous lows, but we are not expecting any continuation besides that until you do in fact see a clear break below that 68 handle. And so looking at it from a 4-hour time frame as of right now, this is definitely setting up as a beautiful sell setup unless you do see higher highs being created. That is your impulse. This is your relief after that short-term reversal pattern did in fact break out. And so if this does in fact start to break out, you could have a potential short-term sell all the way to the lows, and hopefully you start to run it all the way back down. But the safest play is going to be breaks below the lows. And from there, once that breaks out, this is going to be your run all the way back to the downside. Now, if that fails to happen, you guys will be very weary of that 69.34 handle, and if NZD USD does in fact break out, create short-term higher highs followed by some short-term continuation pattern, could potentially have a short-term buy back to the daily resistance and weekly resistance around the 70 handle. Please note that NZD USD is not warranted as a buy until we make a sharp enough impulse above that 70.41 handle, followed by some sort of continuation pattern, and then from there you could expect a rally back to the weekly resistance. And so with that, guys, that's how you break down the dollar index pairs. I hope you guys enjoyed that.